Book beta. So we start off with another translator's note or an author's note here. So I'm going to read it. So here it is. Book beta is a collection of metaphysical problems. These 15 puzzles are developed in the course of the book, but no attempt is made to resolve them. The point of the book is to provide not answers but questions. The characteristic structure of the problems is that of a plausible seeming thesis and equally plausible but contradictory antithesis. Usually, the thesis and the antithesis are taken, one from the extreme naturalists or atomists, the other from the idealists, Pythagoreans, and Platonists. The purpose of the whole exercise is to illustrate the poverty of both these extreme positions, so as to prepare the way for the exposition of Aristotle's own solution in the bulk of the work, which will in many respects be a compromise between materialism and idealism. The first chapter contains a list of the problems, which, however, does not exactly correspond to the order in which they are in fact presented in chapters 2 to 6, and some advisory remarks on how to read the problems. Alright, let's start. Puzzle 1. Is there a single science of the four causes, or several such science? Thesis. There cannot be a single such science, because the four kinds of causation are not contraries, and it is only contraries that make up the domain of a single science. Antithesis. If there are several such sciences, then there can be no way of deciding which science is to be identified with first philosophy. Puzzle 2. Does the same science cover the study of the basic principles of logic and the study of substance? Thesis. The same science cannot study both, because the principles of logic are common to all disciplines and cannot in any case be demonstrated, because they are self-evident and demonstration depends upon them, or on them. Antithesis. On the other hand, if the science of logical axioms is different from that of substance, it is necessary to decide which has priority, and a decision which must favor the universal logical principles, so that it will be they, not substance. That is the proper study of philosophy. Puzzle 3. Is there one or several sciences for the sensible and suprasensible substances? Thesis. If there are two sciences, one for sensible and one for suprasensible substances, we cannot then give a principled decision as to which science is first philosophy. Antithesis. If there is a single science for both substances, how can it fail to turn out that there is really only one science of all things, whether sensible or suprasensible? Puzzle 4. Is the science which studies substance the same as that which also studies the properties of substance? Thesis. If it is the same, then, since the science of properties must be demonstrative, so must the science of substance itself. But substance is not something that can be demonstrated, but only defined. Antithesis. If it is not the same, the science that deals with the properties of substance, but not with substance itself, will not be a science, because a science must deal with a subject and its properties. Puzzle 5. Are there only sensible substances, or also suprasensible substances, and if the latter, are they only Platonic forms, or also the mathematical entities? Thesis. Both Platonic forms and mathematical entities are absurd. Platonic forms merely echo the sensible world without explaining it, and the mathematical entities, if they existed, would have to be paralleled by similar intermediate entities in the other sciences, and this would lead to an infinite regress in all cases. Antithesis. The mathematical sciences are evidently not based on sensible entities, so there must be mathematical entities in their case. However, it is not possible to consider such entities to be immanent in sensible entities themselves, on pain of having two entities with contrary properties in the same place at the same time. Puzzle 6. Are the principles of entities the material elements of which they are composed, or the genera to which they belong? Thesis. There are many examples of principles being taken to be the elements of which something is composed. For instance, the principles of words are their physical elements, and the principles in geometry are those propositions on which demonstration is based. Natural objects, too, are said by philosophers to have as their principles the natural elements of which they are made. And it is thought that we know, for instance, artifacts, which we know their material components, antithesis. But the principles are also taken to be the genera, because things are known by definitions of which the genera are principles and also through their species, for which the genera are also principles. This perspective is, of course, supported by the teaching of Plato. Puzzle 7. If the genera are principles, is it the primary or the ultimate genera that are principles? Thesis. The primary genera cannot be principles, because on this basis the principles would have to be the supreme genera of being in unity, which are not really genera at all. Also, all intermediate genera would have to count as principles, so that the principles of anything would have to be infinite in number. Thus, the principles could only be the ultimate principles. Antithesis. But if the ultimate genera are principles, then the ultimate principle of a thing will not be external to it at all. But principles must be external to what they are principles of. And so what is most a principle must be most external, so that it should be the primary, not the ultimate. Genera that are principles. Puzzle 8. Is there something over and above particular individuals? Thesis. If there is nothing but an infinity of particulars, then science is impossible. It would also in such circumstances be impossible for there to be anything that was immune to process. But since things subject to process demand on at least one thing that is not subject to process, this would mean that things subject to process did not exist either. Antithesis. But if there is something over and above particulars, must there or must there not be one such thing for each sensible particular? This question cannot be given a principled answer, but in any case there is a dilemma. If there is only one universal object, then everything will share the same form, whereas if there are several, there will be many identical forms of substance. Puzzle 9. Do principles have formal or numerical unity? Thesis. If principles have only formal and not numerical unity, then no entities can have numerical unity either, not even one in being, and also science, which depends on something which is numerical, as well as formally a unity uniting particulars, will be impossible. Antithesis. But if the unity of principles is numerical, then there will be again be as many entities as there are principles, so that there will turn out to be so far to a few particular entities. Puzzle 10. Are the principles of perishable and of imperishable things the same or different? Thesis. If they are the same, how can some of the things of which they are principles be imperishable while others are perishable? Antithesis. If, on the other hand, they are different, there is a dilemma about the principles of perishable things. Are these principles themselves perishable? If they are, then either they will have to have further principles of principles, which is absurd, or all perishable things will at some point cease to be produced. But if they are not, we have the problem that from the same imperishable principles, both imperishable and perishable things are derived. Puzzle 11. Puzzle 11. Are one and being per se substances, or are they predicable of other things? Thesis. If one and being are not substances, then neither will the other universals be, nor will number be a per se substance. Antithesis. If one and being are substances, then everything will have to be one and being, and Parmenides will be right. Also, number will be impossible because number requires a plurality of units, which is incompatible with one being a substance. Multiplicity cannot be derived from a necessarily single thing. Puzzle 12. Are numbers, bodies, surfaces, and points substances or not? Thesis. What else could be? Affections, relations, movements, etc. cannot be substances because they are predicable, nor can the elements and their affections be determinate substances. So only body can be substance, and body is determined by surface, which is in turn determined by line, and this by point. So what determines something is its substance. Points would seem to be substances most of all. And it was on this basis that the Platonists and Pythagoreans suggested that numbers were basic substances. Antithesis. On the other hand, if points, lines, and surfaces are more substantial than bodies, they cannot be insensible bodies, whereas in fact it is usually thought that points, lines, and surfaces are not substances but divisions of bodies, being present not actually but potentially in them. Puzzle 13. Is it necessary to allow forms in addition to sensible entities and the quote-unquote intermediate entities? Thesis. The intermediate entities are not numerically determinate, so that their principles are also not numerically determinate, but it must be the case that the principles are both formally and numerically determinate. Only the admission of forms can ensure this. Antithesis. But this leads to the difficulty introduced in Puzzle 9. Puzzle 14. Do principles have being in potentiality or in actuality? Thesis. If they have being in actuality, there must be something prior to the principles, namely their potentiality, since potentiality precedes actuality. Antithesis. But if the principles have being in potentiality, everything which is could not be, since what is not, yet also has being in potentiality. Puzzle 15. Are the principles universal or particular? Thesis. If they are universals, they cannot be substances, on pain of Platonism. Antithesis. But if they are particulars, they cannot fall in the domain of a science, which always studies universals. There would then absurdly have to be principles of principles for science to study. Beta. It is necessary with regard to the science that we are seeking that we should first address those puzzles that first arise, and those which others have supposed to be different about these same things, and also anything in addition to these that we may happen to have left out. For those who wish to make good progress must start well, for subsequent progress depends on the resolution of the first puzzles. And one cannot solve these without knowing the difficulty and the confusion of our minds show this to be the case with the matter. For in the way in which it is puzzled, in that way it undergoes something like what happens to prisoners, for it is impossible for either of them to move forward. So we must first set out all the difficulties, both for these reasons, and also because those who inquire, without first setting out the difficulties, are like those who do not know in which direction they should walk, and in addition do not even know whether they would recognize that which they are looking for. For the end is not clear to these, but it is for those who have begun with the puzzles, and also from the point of view of judging that man must be better off who has heard, as it were, all the rival and opposed positions. Now, the first puzzle is that which we raised in our preliminary remarks, whether it belongs to one or to many sciences to consider the principles, and whether it is for the science only to see the primary principles of the substances, or whether all thinkers should, in the way in which we can say that one thing is both the same and not the same, on the basis of what they have shown, also make demonstrations about the subsequent points, and also, if it concerns substance, whether it is about one or many, and if there are many, then whether they have affinities, or rather we should call some of them wisdoms and some by some other name. And this is another thing that it is necessary to seek, whether we should say that only the sensible substances exist, or other also in addition to these, and whether in a single way or various kinds of substances, as with those who posit the forms and the mathematical entities mediate between them and the sensibles. Concerning these things, then, as we say, we must consider, and also whether the theory is only about substances or also about the intrinsically accidental properties of substances. And also we must think about sameness and difference and similarity and dissimilarity and opposition, and about prior and posterior and all other such things about which dialecticians try to consider, basing their inquiry solely on the received opinions, to whom it does belong to consider all things. and also the intrinsic properties of these things, and not only what each of these things is, but also whether one thing is the opposite of another, and whether the principles and genera and elements exist, or rather the things into which each is divided, and if the genera, then whether they are those called final and first for the individuals, such as whether animal or man is a principle and exists rather than the individual. But we must especially inquire and investigate whether there is any cause beyond matter in itself or not, and whether this is separable or not, and whether it is one or many in number, and whether there is anything beyond the whole, by which I mean when something is predicated of the matter or nothing, or in some cases yes, and in some cases no, and of what kind such of the entities are, and also whether the principles are defined by number or by form, both those in accounts and those in subjects, and whether they are the same or different for both perishable and imperishable substances, and whether they are all imperishable or those of perishable substances are perishable. And also that which has the greatest difficulty of all, whether the one and the existent, as the Pythagoreans and Plato said, is not something else but a substance of the entities, or not. But something else is the substrate, in the way that Empedocles, if that's how you pronounce his name, hopefully I pronounced it right, says that it is love, and some other says fire, or water, or air, and whether the principles are general or like particulars, and whether in potentiality or actuality, and whether in other ways or by movement, for these things might also provide considerable puzzlement, and also whether the numbers and lengths and points and shapes and points are kinds of substances or not, and whether the substances would be separated from the sensibles or indwelling in them. For about all these things, it is not only hard to reach the truth, but not even easy to come up with a sensible account. Let us deal first, then, with the problems that we first mentioned, whether it belongs to one or to many sciences to consider all the kinds of causes. For how could a single science grasp them, given that the principles are not opposites, and also many entities do not have all features? For in what way can there be a principle of change in things that are unchanged or the nature of good? If indeed everything that might be good in itself and through its own nature is an end, and in this way a cause, in that it is for the sake of it that other things both come into being and exist, and the end and the for the sake of which are the end of some action, and all actions involve movement, so it would be impossible for this principle to be in the things that are not moved, nor for anything to be a good in itself. And that is why nothing in mathematics is shown in this way, nor is there any proof which rests on something being better or worse. And in fact, nobody makes mention of any such things at all. So that for this reason, some of the sophists, such as Aristotle, have rejected them entirely. For in the other skills, even the Benosic ones, such as building and cobbling, since all things are said to be better or worse done, but no one gives such an account of mathematics concerning good and bad states. But indeed, if there are several sciences of the causes, and different ones for different principles, which of these should we assert to be the one that we are looking for, or who should we say to be especially knowledgeable of the affair that we are investigating of those which have them? For it is possible for the same man to know all the ways of the causes, such as, for a house, that from which is the movement is the skill and the builder, and that for which is the function and the matter is earth and stones, and the form is the account. From the things, then, that we have long ago defined, which should we call wisdom, or should we do so of them all? For to the extent that a science is more directive and hegemonic, and to the extent that it is not right for the other sciences to contradict it any more than slaves might. The science of the end and of the good is of this kind, for it is for this that the others exist, but to the extent that it has been defined to be of the primary causes and of the most knowable thing, that sort of science would be the science of substance. For though they often know the same thing, We say rather that he who knows the essence really knows the thing as to what it is, and by knowing what it is not. And of these, one more than another, and especially the man who knows the what it is, and not how much or of what kind or what it naturally does or undergoes. And in all other subjects, we think that man knows on each occasion, and we think that he has knowledge when we know what the thing is. Example is, what is squaring, the discovery of the median, and so with the others. Whereas, about its coming into being and its doings, and about all its alteration, we think that we have knowledge when we know the source of its movement. And this is the opposite and set against the end, so that it would seem to belong to another science to survey each of these two causes. And indeed, in connection with demonstrative principles, whether they belong to one science or to many, there is controversy. And by demonstrative, I mean those common opinions from which they demonstrate everything else. For instance, it is necessary that everything be either asserted or denied, and that it is impossible for something both to be and not to be. And all other such premises, whether there is one single science of these and of substances or another, and if there should be one, how we should describe that which we are currently seeking. Well, it is not reasonable that there should be one, for how could one claim any resemblance between this science and, say, geometry? If then it is the same with absolutely any science, then it cannot be so for all of them, just as it does not belong to the others nor to that which scrutinizes substance to have knowledge about these. And again, in what way will it be a science of them? For what each of these things happens to be we already know. Indeed, other skills make use of them as already known. For it is necessary that a demonstration must have some fundamental premises, so that the result is that there is one single kind of all these things, since all demonstrative sciences use the axioms. And indeed, if there is a different science for these and for substances, which of them is prior and master? For the axioms are rather the more general and the principles of all things. If this does not belong to the philosopher, who else will have the job of considering truth and falsity in their case? And in general, is there some one single science of all substances, or many? And if there is not one, of what sort of substance should we suppose that one to be? It is not reasonable that there should be one for all substances, for then there would also be one science that would be demonstrative about all accidents. If all demonstrative science considers some substrate and the things happening to it from the received opinions, and it surely belongs to the same science to consider the accidental properties of what is its subject from the same opinions. For there is a single science of what and of the whence, either the same or some other, so that either the same ones or some one of them will also consider the accidents. And also whether the theory is only concerned with substances or also with their accidents. I mean, for instance, if the solid is a kind of substance, and also the line and the plane, whether it belongs to the same science to know all these things and the accidents for each kind about which mathematics makes demonstrations, or to some other. For if it is for the same one, then the science of substance would also be demonstrative. But there does not seem to be a demonstration of the what it is. But if it belongs to some other science, which science will it be that considers the accidents for a substance? For this would be very hard to deliver. Or should we say that there are only the sensible substances, or others also besides these? And do there happen to be manifold or only single kinds of entities, such as with those who posit the forms and the intermediates, concerning which we assert the mathematical sciences to be? As we say, then, the forms are said to be causes and substances in themselves in the first book about them. But in many ways they present difficulties, none less the absurdity of saying that there are some natures in addition to those in the heaven, and to say that there are the same ones for the sensibles, except that some are eternal and some perishable. For we say that there is the form of man, and also of horse and health, but nothing else, making the same sort of mistake as those who say that there are gods, but that they are in the form of men. For they are doing nothing else positing eternal men. And these thinkers are not positing forms, but eternal sensibles. And if one posits, in addition to the sensibles and the forms, the mediate entities, then there will be many absurdities. For it is obvious how lines will be in regard to themselves and to the perceptible ones, and so with each of the other kinds, so that given the astrology is the single science of these things, there will be some heaven in addition to the sensible heaven, and sun and moon, and all the other things in the heaven. And yet, how should one believe in such things? For it is not even reasonable that they should be unmoved, but since they are moved, it is completely impossible. And the same goes for those things studied by optics and mathematical harmonics, for it is impossible that these should exist in addition to the sensibles, for the same reasons. For if there are immediate where is it? For if there are immediate sensibles and sensations, it is obvious that there will also be immediate animals between them and the perishable ones. And one might have the problem about which entities one should seek in such sciences. For if geometry will discern the geodesics in this way only, in that one is of the things that we perceive, while the other is of those that we do not, it is obvious that in addition to medicine there will be some other science, and with all the others the same, between medicine itself and the medicine of everyday experience. And yet how is that possible? For there would then also be certain healthy things between the healthy itself and the perceived healthies. And yet this is not true either, that the geodesic is of perceived and perishable magnitudes, for it would have been destroyed when they are. And similar astrology would turn out not to be about the perceived sizes and the observed heaven, for perceived lines are not of the same kind as the geometer pronounces. For none of the sensibles is in this way straight or curved, for the circle does not touch the ruler at a point, as Protagoras said in his criticism of the geometers. Nor are the movements and rotations of the heaven such as those with which astrology deals, nor do the signs have the same natures as stars. But there are some who say that there are so-called intermediate entities between the forms and the sensibles, but not separate from the sensibles, but in them. And the absurd consequences of this would take a long argument to reveal. And it is sufficient to consider such things, for it would not be reasonable to say this much only on the case, but it is clear that the forms would also have to be in the sensibles, for they both have the same account, so that there would also have to be two bodies in the same place, and the forms could not be changeless if they were in changing things. And anyway, why should one suppose that there are such things but that they are in the sensibles? For the same absurdities will follow as above. There will be a heaven in addition to the heaven, except that it will not be separate but in the same place, which is still more impossible. Concerned with these matters, there is great uncertainty as to which positions are likely to be conducive to truth, and in connection with the principles, whether it is right to suppose that the kinds are the elements and principles, or rather the primary things from which each thing is, as the elements and principles of voice are thought to be the things from which primary voices are made, but not the common thing voice. And we say that those things are elements of diagrams, of which the demonstrations are present in the demonstrations of either all or most other things. Even of bodies, the pluralists think that there are elements, and so do monists, as Empedocles says that fire and water and so forth are the elements from which entities are constructed. But he does not mention these things as types of entity. And in addition to these, if anyone else wanted to conjecture a nature, such as that of a bed, saying from what parts it was constructed and how put together, then he will know its nature. On these grounds, the principles would not be the kinds of entities, and if we know each thing by definitions, and the principles are the kinds of definitions, it is necessary that the kinds are the principles of defined things. And if it is possible to grasp the science of entities, and also to grasp the science of the forms by which they say that things exist, then the kinds will be the principles of the forms. And it seems that some also of those who say that the elements of entities are the one or being, or the being, or the great and the small, are using them as creations. But in neither way can we speak of the principles, for the account of substance is one, and another will be that of definition by kind, and that which gives the constituents. In addition, even if the kinds are as much principles as you like, should we think that the primary kinds are principles or ultimate ones categorized of individuals? For this too is controversial, for if it is always the universals that are rather principles, it is clear that they will be the highest of the kinds. For these are said of all things, there will then be as many principles of entities as there are primary kinds, so that one and being will be principles and substances. For these things are said of the largest number of things, but it is not possible that there be one kind of things, either the one or the being. For it is necessary that the differentiae of each kind both are and are each single, and it is impossible either to predicate the species of the genus with their own differentiae, or the genus without its own species, so that if the one or being were a kind, then neither being nor the one would be a differentia. But if there are no kinds, then there will not be any principles either. If the kinds are principles, and the mediates and the mediates included with the differentiae will be kinds down to the individuals, whereas in fact some are thought to be and some are not. And furthermore, the differentiae are still more principles than the kinds, and if these are principles, then there will be an infinity of principles, so to speak, especially if one were to make the primary kind a principle. But indeed, even if the one is more like a principle and the one is undivided, then the whole universe will be undivided either in quantity or in form, so that the one would be more like the last predicable. For man is not the kind of certain man. For man is not the kind of certain men, and in things for which the prior and the posterior arise, it is not possible that in this case there should be anything beyond them. Example is like, if the dyad is the first of numbers, then there will be no numbers beyond the forms of numbers. And similarly, no shapes beyond the form of shape. And if it is not of these, then it is unlikely that there will be principles of other entities except for the forms. Four of them they especially seem to be kinds, but in individuals there is no prior and posterior. But wherever there is better and worse, there always the better is a prior. There always the better is prior. So that of these two there would not be a genus. From all this, it rather appears that the things predicated of individuals are rather the principles than the kinds. But again, it is not easy to say how we should take these to be the principles, for the principle and cause should exist beside the thing of which they are, and should be separable from them. And why should one assume this of individual properties, except in that they are universally predicated and for all things? But if this is the reason, we should consider more universal things rather to be principles, so that the principles would be the primary kinds. There is a puzzle connected with these, which is the hardest and yet most necessary to consider of all, and concerning it we have so far given no account. For either there is nothing else besides individuals, the individuals are limitless, then how is it possible to have science of an infinity? For insofar as it is one and the same thing, and insofar as it has some general property, to that extent is it possible to know all things. But if indeed this is necessary, and there must be something in addition to the individuals, then these will either be the ultimates or the primaries. And we have just shown that this is impossible. And if there is as much as you like something other than the whole, whenever something is predicated of matter, there is something. Should it be something beyond everything else, or be beyond some things but not beyond others, or beyond nothing? If, then, there is nothing beyond the individuals, then there would be nothing intelligible, but all things would be sensible, and there would be science of nothing, unless one were to say that perception was science, and also there would be nothing that was eternal and unmoved, for all sensibles are perishable and in motion. But if there is nothing eternal, then there cannot be generation, for there must be something that is generated and something from which it is generated, and the last of this series must be ungenerated. If it comes to an end, and it is impossible that there should be generation from what is not, and since there is generation and change, there must also be limit. For no movement is unlimited, and of all movement there is an end. And that which cannot become cannot be created, and the becoming must have been when it first became. And again, if matter exists through being ungenerated, then it is all the more reasonable that substance can be, whenever matter is generated. For if the one is not, then neither will the other be, and there will be nothing at all. But if this is impossible, then there must be something besides the whole, the shape, namely, and the form. And again, if someone should suppose this, then this will produce puzzles in some cases, and in some cases not. For it is clear that it cannot be so in all cases, for we should not suppose that there might be some house in addition to particular horses. Furthermore, is there one substance for all things, such as for all men? But this is absurd, for all those things are one of which the substance is one. But can they be many and different? This too is unreasonable. But how will the matter for each of these things come about, and is the whole both these things? And one might also raise the following problem about the principles. If they are one in form, then there will be nothing one in number, not even the one itself in being. And indeed it will be possible to know in a way if there is not the one over many. But if each of the principles is one in number, and not as with the sensibles, but for the others, as with such and such a syllable being one in form, then the principles will be one in form. For these are several in number. But if this is not so, and the principles of the entities are one in number, then nothing else will exist apart from the elements. For it makes no difference whether we speak of the particular or the one in number. For by the one in number we mean the particular, and by the general we mean what is above them. So that if the elements of voice were defined in number, then it would be necessary that all the lines were as numerous as the elements, there not being two or more the same. But a no less grave puzzle remains both for the present theorists and for the previous ones, whether there are the same principles for the perishable as for imperishable substances, or different ones. Now, if there are the same, how is it that some things are perishable and others imperishable, and for what cause? Now, those of the school of Hesiod and all those who, as theologians, only considered what is plausible in this connection, and made little of us, for by making the gods the principles and making creation from the gods, they say that those who do not eat the nectar and ambrosia are born mortal, clearly mentioning names that are known to them. And yet we have ourselves spoken about such a provision of causes, for if they address them for the sake of pleasure, then nectar and ambrosia are not at all the cause of their being. And if they are the cause of their being, then how could they be eternal if they need food? But about those who have invented clever mythologies, it is not worthwhile to take a serious look. But of those who speak by demonstration, we are entitled to demand an answer to the question why indeed things coming from the same source are in some cases eternal in nature, and in others are destroyed. But since they neither give a reason, nor is it reasonable that it should be so, it is clear that there are not the same principles nor causes for them. And indeed, the one to whom one might reasonably ascribe this opinion, Empedocles, even he suffered the same thing, for he supposed a certain principle that was responsible for destruction in strife. But he seemed no less to generate this from the one, for everything else is from this except God. Indeed, he says, quote unquote, from which all things that were and are, trees flourished forth, and men and women both, and ominous birds, and water-nourished fish, and indeed long-yeared gods. And it is clear even without these lines, for if they were not present in affairs, then all things would be one, as he puts it. For when they came together, then, quote unquote, last most was strife. And so it happens for him that the most blessed God is the least wise of them all. For he does not know all things, for he does not have strife, and cognition is of like by like. Quote unquote, for earth by earth, he says, quote unquote, we see water by water, and noble air by air, and love by love, and strife by bitter strife. But from where the ratio comes, this clear, it becomes about that for him strife is no more the cause of destruction than being is. And in the same way, neither is love the cause of being. For by drawing things to be the one, it destroys other things. And at the same time, he gives no cause for this change, except that they are so constituted. Quote unquote, but when great strife was swollen in its limbs, to honor them in fullest time it came which spins about its center like an oath. The assumption is that it changes out of necessity, but he reveals not a cause for the necessity. And yet this is as much as he says in agreement, for he does not make some things perishable and other things imperishable, but all things imperishable except the element. But the present puzzle is why some things are perishable and some not. If they are from the same principles, that then there are not the same principles. So much let it be said, but if principles are different, then one puzzle is whether they will themselves be perishable or imperishable. Now, if they are perishable, then it is clear that they must too come from other principles, for everything is destroyed to that from which it comes. So that it turns out that some other principles are prior to the principles, and this is impossible, both if it ends and if there is a regress. And then how will the perishable things be if their principles are removed? But if they are imperishable, how is it that from imperishable things, perishable things should come? But from other principles, imperishable things? For this does not make sense, but it is either impossible or requires extensive discussion. And again, no one has tried to suggest other ones, but they say that there are the same principles for all things. And the first puzzle they brush aside, as though assuming that it is trivial, and also most hard to consider but most necessary for knowledge, is the question whether being and the one are substances of entities, with each of them not being some other thing, while the one is the one and being. Or whether we have to ask what the one is and being with some other nature as substrate. For some think that nature is in one way, some in the other. Well, Plato and the Pythagoreans think that the one and being are not different in nature, but the same, since substance is the same to be one and to be being. But the students of nature, such as Empedocles, make the whole point more familiar by saying what the one is. For he would seem to be saying that love is some such thing, for it is the cause of everything's being one, whereas others cite fire, or as air, as the one and being, from which come the things that are and the things that become. And in the same way those who posit a plurality of elements, for it is necessary that these should also say that the one and being are as many as they assert there to be principles. And the result is that if one supposes there to be some substance, the one and being, then there will not be any of the other things, for these are the most general of all things. But if there is not one itself or being itself, then there is hardly likely to be one of the others, except for the individuals that have been mentioned. But if there is something that is both the one and being, then it is necessary that its substance be the one and being, for it will not be some other thing predicated of it, but these very things. But indeed, if unity itself and being itself exists, then there is a great puzzle how there will be anything apart from them, by which I mean how entities will be more than one. For there is no other to being, so that, as Parmenides said, it is necessary that all things are one, and that this is being. But on either way of taking it is difficult. For if the one is not a substance, or if the one itself exists, it is impossible that number should be a substance. But if it should not be, we have said above why not. And if it is, then the same puzzle arises in connection without being. For from what other unity will this other unity arise? For it is necessary that it is not one or many things, of which each is one. Again, if the one itself cannot be divided, then, by Zeno's reasoning, nothing would exist. For that which neither by adding nor subtracting makes either larger or smaller, one does not say that this is one of the entities, on the obvious assumption that an entity must have magnitude, and if it must have magnitude, then it must be bodily, for that is something that is in all ways, and other things do in a way make something larger by their addition, but in a way they do not, such as the plane and the line. But the point and the monad not at all. But since Zeno reasoned wrongly, and it is possible to have something that is indivisible, so we must answer this paradox. For such a thing being added will not make something bigger. But how from such a thing, or from many such things, will magnitude arise? For it is the same as saying that the line is a collection of points. And indeed, if one so supposed it so that it would be generated, as some say, from the one itself and something else that is not one in number, then no less must we inquire why and how it is sometimes a number and sometimes a magnitude from which is generated. If indeed the not one is oddness and has the same nature, for it cannot be as out of one in the same or as out of some number, that magnitude would also arise, as is clear. The next puzzle after this one is whether numbers and bodies and planes and points are kinds of substances or not. Are a kind of substance or not, sorry. For if, on the one hand, they are not, then it escapes us what the being is and what are the substances of entities. For affections and processes and relations and dispositions and ratios are not thought to indicate the substance of anything, for they are all said of some subject, and none of them is this such. But the things that might particularly be thought to designate substance, water and earth and fire and air, from which composite bodies are composed, of these warmths and coldness and such like are the affections, not substances. And the body that undergoes them is the only thing that persists, being a kind of entity and a kind of substance. But indeed body would be less of a substance than surface. And this then line, and this then the monad in the point, for it is by these that body is defined, and it is thought that they can exist without body, whereas it is not possible that the body can exist without them. That is why both the majority and the earlier thinkers thought that entity and substance were body, and that the other things were affections of it. So that the principles of bodies would also be the principles of entities, while those more recent or wiser thought that they were numbers. So as we said, if these things are not substance, there is in general no substance and no entity. For it is certainly not appropriate to call the affections of these entities. But now, if this is agreed that lengths and points are rather substances than bodies, yet we still do not see of what sort of bodies there should be, for it is impossible that they should be among the perceptibles. And so there would turn out to be no substance. And it also seems that all these things are divisions of bodies in width, depth, and length. In addition, there is similarly present in the solid some sort of shape or none, so that if Hermes is not in the stone, then neither is the half cube in the way that it is defined. And so neither would the surface be, for if it is of any kind, then this would also be the one that marked off the half. And the same goes for points, lines, and monads, so that if body is substance most of all, and some more than others, but that not even the latter are substances. It escapes us what the being is and what is the substance of the entities. For in addition to what has been said, it also turns out that our account of creation and destruction does not make sense, for it is thought that substance, if it is not prior in actuality or should be in posterior, suffers from these things from being created and being destroyed. But it is not possible that points and lines and surfaces should be either created or destroyed, sometimes being and sometimes not. For whenever bodies are touched or divided, then either a single one touched or two divided arise, so that it is not agreed to be destroyed. And when they are divided ones that did not previously exist, now do, for the individual point cannot be divided into two. And if they do get created and destroyed, from what would they be created? And the situation over time is the same as that in the present, since this too cannot come into existence and cease to be, but always seems to be something else, not being some substance. And it is also clear that this applies to points, lines, and planes. The argument is the same, for they are all in the same way either divisions or boundaries. And we might in general pose the puzzle why we should also seek certain other things beyond the perceptibles and the intermediaries, such as the posited forms. For if it is because the mathematicals differ from the latter in some other way, and that the many are of the same form, this makes no difference, so that their principle will not be defined in number, just as the numerical principles of our lines will not be circumscribed altogether, but will be in form. If one should not take a given syllable or vowel, and of these they will also be numerically circumscribed, and the same will go for the case of the intermediaries, for their too co-specifics are limitless, so that if there are not in addition to the perceptibles and the mathematicals certain other entities which some call forms, there will be no numerically single substance, nor will the principles of entities be of a certain number but only in form. If, then, this is necessary, then it is necessary for this reason to posit the forms. For if those who have supported them have not argued well, this is still what they want, and it is necessary that they should say this, that each of the forms is a kind of substance, and nothing accidental. But if indeed we suppose the forms to exist, and that the principles are one in number but not in form, we will be articulating impossibilities as necessary consequences. And next to these, there is the question whether the elements exist potentially or in some other way. For if they do it in some other way, then there will be something else prior to the principles. For the potentiality is prior to that type of cause. And it is not necessary that all the potentials should be in that way. But if the elements do exist potentially, then it is possible that none of the entities exist. For that which does not yet exist is also a potential existent. For that which is not comes into being, and nothing comes into being of the things that cannot be. These, then, are the puzzles with which we must deal in connection with the principles, and also whether they are general or, as we claim, particular. For if they are general, they will not be substances, for none of the common things signifies a this such but and such of a kind, whereas substance is a this such. But if some this such is to exist and the universal category be excluded, then Socrates will be many things, both himself and man and an animal. If each one of these indicates a this such and a unity, if then the principles are general, this turns out. But if they are not universal but as particulars, then they will not be knowable, for knowledge is always of generalities. So other principles which are universally predicated will be prior to the principles, if there is to be knowledge of them. That is the end. The next book is Book Gamma.